This is a continuation of The Destiny Disrupted, a history of the world through Islamic eyes. This is the part 2 of this series. We will continue where we left off. Chapter 4, Schism. 24 to 40 AH. 644 to 661 CE. The third Khalifa, 22 to 36 AH. 644 to 656 CE. Othman was Muhammad's fifth cousin once removed, and he took office as Islam's third Khalifa at the age of 68. To understand his stormy 12-year term, it's useful to look at who the man was and how he came to head up the community that ruled the Middle World. Othman's father had been one of the richest men in Mecca, and Othman inherited his father's millions when he was 20. With a deft touch for business, he managed to multiply that wealth many times over before he was even in his 30s, earning the nickname of Othman Ghani, Othman the Wealthy. Chaste and modest even before his conversion, Othman never drank, smoked, or chased women. Around Mecca, he was famous for his good looks. People even went so far as to call him beautiful, yet an air of anxious melancholy always surrounded this austere, soft-spoken man. He converted to Islam about a year after Muhammad began his preaching and 9 years before the Hijrah. His conversion story begins one evening when he was on his way home from a successful business trip. Reputedly, Othman had stopped someplace for the night and was lying under the stars, looking up at the black dome of the sky, when the immensity of the universe suddenly overwhelmed him. Along with a crushing sense of his own insignificance came a conviction that somebody was in control, that this universe had a master, and what a master he must be. At that moment, even though he was alone, Othman heard a penetrating voice announce out loud that the messenger of God was in the world. As soon as he got home, the story goes, Othman went to his friend Abu Bakr, who told him the curious tale of Muhammad and his message about a single, omnipotent God. Othman immediately announced himself a believer. His conversion enraged his family. After all, his clan, the aristocratic Umayyads, was the most rabidly anti-Muslim faction of the Quraysh tribe. Othman's uncle Abu Sufyan would soon emerge as the leader of the anti-Muslim forces. Othman's stepfather had once attacked Muhammad in an alley and would have strangled him if Abu Bakr had not intervened. Othman's 2 wives reviled him for embracing Muhammad's faith. They would not convert, so Othman divorced them and married the Prophet's famously beautiful daughter Ruqayyah. When she died, Othman married another daughter of Muhammad's, Kulthum. The Muslims were no doubt glad to have a rich man in their ranks, and Othman was glad to help his fellow Muslims any way he could, but the main way he could think of was to provide money. Once, when abuse of Muslims was peaking in Mecca, Muhammad decided that a group of his followers should emigrate to Abyssinia, and Othman helped finance that. He himself emigrated with the group as well, and in Abyssinia forged fruitful business connections that made him even richer than before. A few years later he returned to Mecca, where his Abyssinian connection size served him so well he grew even richer. For most Muslims, the Hijrah meant losing everything they owned. They knew nothing about farming, the main occupation in Medina, so the move impoverished them. But not Othman. Although he emigrated with the others, he never quite severed his ties to business associates back home, and with those associates looking after his properties and business interests, Othman continued to prosper, even in Medina. There was never any suggestion that he garnered by his wealth dishonestly, quite the opposite. Some people simply have the golden touch, and Othman was such a man. Nor was he a miser. He spent lavishly for the public good. For example, he expanded the mosque in Medina for Muhammad, and when the Muslims needed water, he bought a valuable well from one of the Jewish tribes and donated it to the public. Staggering wealth, dazzling beauty, 2 of the Prophet's daughters for wives, what did this man lack? And yet Othman seemed haunted by the fear that he was not good enough. He spent much of his time fasting, praying, and reading the Quran. Perhaps his extravagant donations to the public good were attempts to deserve the extraordinary good fortune he already enjoyed. Or perhaps he worried that his character was not quite at the level of the Prophet's other close companions. He missed the Battle of Badr because his wife was sick. At the Battle of Uhud, when a rumor spread that Muhammad had been killed, Othman was among the Muslims who abandoned hope and left the field. Othman redeemed himself at the Battle of the Moat, but shortly after that battle, his son died, and Othman seemed to feel that God was still punishing him. To earn forgiveness, he made a practice of buying slaves and liberating one each Friday. After Muhammad died, Othman worried that the community might fall apart, but in addition he seemed particularly afraid for his own individual soul. "How will we now be safe from the snares of the devil?" he lamented. Fear of the hereafter consumed the poor man. "Every day is doomsday," he once said, by which he meant there is never an instant when it's safe to stop being good, so he for one stepped up his fasting and praying, and dispensed ever more extravagant contributions, trying desperately to deserve a place in paradise that the Prophet Muhammad had assured him was already his. This haunted giant of benevolence became the third Khalifa of Islam. When Omar began his caliphate, Islam had been a new kind of social organism still growing into its identity. Omar's caliphate was filled with a sense of spiritual adventure, invention, and discovery. By the time Othman took charge, the Islamic community was a government in control of a vast territory. It was no longer enough to preach, defend, attack, and spread holy excitement. Muslim leaders now had to collect taxes, run courts, keep bridges and highways in repair, set salaries, define duties for various positions, all that dull administrative stuff of daily life. Managing this transition fell to Othman. One great project Othman saw to fruition during the first half of his caliphate was the preparation of a definitive edition of the Quran. He set scholars to work combing out redundancies among the copies that existed, resolving discrepancies, and evaluating passages whose authenticity was subject to doubt. The final product was compiled into a book in which the verses were arranged more or less in order of length, rather than thematically or chronologically. All other compilations, competing versions, and rejected verses were destroyed. From then on, every Quran would be the same, word for word, and that's the Quran all Muslims have today. You can see why this had to be done if the priority was to keep the community unified, but you can also see why this project might have disgruntled some Muslims, especially if they already had suspicions about Othman's intentions, as some did. Next came the job of setting the community's finances in order. In the Prophet's time, there were basically no state expenditures. All money that flowed into Medina was distributed more or less immediately. Abu Bakr and Omar had operated in much the same way, although Abu Bakr did set up a treasury, and Omar did build up a surplus out of which he paid stipends to soldiers, the beginnings of a standing army for Islam. Under Othman, however, the treasury swelled into a regular organ of government, which financed an ever-proliferating array of state expenses. This third Khalifa dramatically increased the flow of tax revenues from his far-flung provinces. When Amr ibn al-As, the governor of Egypt, failed to send in enough money, Othman dismissed him and appointed his own foster brother Abdullah to the post. Abdullah succeeded in getting a great deal more money out of the province, in fact, doubling the revenue from Egypt, proving that Othman had made a wise business decision, but Amr ibn al-As grumbled that his successor was getting more milk out of the she-camel only by starving the camel's young. Islamic rule was acquiring hints of possible oppression and corruption. Othman upheld Omar's prohibitions against confiscating land in conquered territories, but he lifted Omar's restrictions on Muslims buying land there, for Othman believed in economic freedom. In fact, he let eminent Muslims borrow money out of the public treasury to finance such purchases. Soon, Muslim elites, including most of the Prophet Muhammad's companions, were amassing fortunes and acquiring immense estates throughout the new Islamic empire. Othman's economic reforms tended to profit his own clan, the Umayyads, above all because they were best situated to take out loans from the treasury. This Khalifa also appointed his relatives and favorites to many powerful political posts throughout the empire, simply because they were the people he knew best and trusted most. As a result, the Umayyads ended up acquiring disproportionate clout, both economically and politically. The third Khalifa continued to practice an austere lifestyle but demanded no such austerity from his officials. Being a rich man, he took no salary, but he did dole out grants to his favorites and spent lavishly on public works. His administration built over 5,000 new mosques across the empire. Othman promoted a building boom that turned Medina into a city of broad streets and imposing buildings paved with fine tile, including a palatial mansion for Othman himself, a headquarters suitable to the dignity of his powerful office. Within this palace Othman lived on bread, water, and prayer. Throughout the empire, Othman demonstrated his business genius by ordering improvements beneficial to commerce. Canals were dug, highways built, irrigation systems improved. Ports got new facilities. Proliferating cities got new wells and water systems, and new bazaars regulated by government-appointed market officers. The Muslim enterprise didn't have quite the same flavor as it had in Omar's day, but who could argue with prosperity? On questions of personal morality such as drinking and sex, Othman's asceticism put him beyond criticism. If piety consisted of penance and prayer, he had to rank among the top 10 most pious men of his time, but Othman saw no ethical ambiguity in people making money, so long as their money-making promoted overall well-being. One of Othman's great favorites was his cousin Muawiyah. Omar had appointed Muawiyah governor of Damascus and its surroundings. Othman kept adding bits to his cousin's territory, until Muawiyah governed everything from the headwaters of the Euphrates River down the Mediterranean coast to Egypt. Muawiyah was the son of Abu Sufyan, the Meccan tribal aristocrat who led the attack on Islam in 2 of those 3 iconic battles between Mecca and Medina. Muawiyah's mother, Hind, followed her husband to those battles, and at Uhud, after the Muslims fled, she reputedly ate the liver of Muhammad's fallen uncle Hamza in an act of triumphalist gloating. The Prophet, however, was never one to hold a grudge. As soon as someone embraced Islam, he or she became part of the family, and so it was with the Umayyads. The Prophet thought Muawiyah especially competent and kept him close after his conversion. No doubt Omar appointed Muawiyah governor of Damascus because he got things done, but perhaps Omar should have paused to consider why Muhammad had kept the man so close. Once ensconced in Damascus, Muawiyah put his brilliance to work assembling a standing army loyal to himself. This would have grim consequences after Othman's untimely death. Toward the end of Othman's 12-year reign, grumbling began to sound throughout the empire. In Egypt, his foster brother was squeezing people so hard for money that riots broke out. Egyptian notables wrote to the Khalifa, begging him to recall the governor. Hearing nothing back, they sent a delegation to petition him in person. As it happened, at this very time, groups of disgruntled citizens were converging on the city from the north as well. Apparently, Othman had displeased a lot of people. All these petitioners made Othman nervous. He begged Ali to go out and talk to the malcontents on his behalf, placate them and persuade them to go home, but Ali refused, perhaps because he himself disapproved of the third Khalifa's policies and practices. He advised Othman to secure himself by addressing the people's legitimate complaints. Finally, Othman gave in and met with the Egyptian delegation. He promised to replace his foster brother and told the Egyptians to go home and let the governor know a new man would soon be coming to replace him. The Egyptians started back, feeling pretty good, but along the way they caught up with a slave of Othman's. Something about the man aroused their suspicions. They searched him and found a letter on his person, seemingly signed by the Khalifa and addressed to the governor of Egypt, which told Governor Abdullah to arrest the delegation of malcontents as soon as they showed up at his court and to execute them as soon as it seemed politic. The delegation returned to Medina in a fury. Othman came dithering out of the palace to meet them on the steps. Back so soon? What was wrong? They showed him the letter and Othman expressed shock. He swore he had never written such a thing, never heard of it until this moment. In fact, his troublemaking cousin Marwan, a relative and ally of the governor of Damascus, might have penned the letter and forged the Khalifa's signature to it. Poor Othman, nearly 80 at this time, might well have been easy to manipulate. In any case, the peaceful petitioners turned into an angry mob. First, they demanded that the Khalifa deliver Muawiyah's brother to them. The Khalifa refused. Then they demanded that Othman step down and let some better man take over. Othman indignantly refused this too. His obligation was to God, he said, and quitting his office at the behest of a mob would be an affront to God. He then retired to his private chambers, where he lit a little lamp and settled in a corner to do what he always did in times of turmoil and doubt, humbly read his Quran. Outside his palace, the rioters worked themselves into a frenzy, broke down palace doors, and burst in with a roar. They found the Khalifa in his study, and there in the flickering twilight of the old man's lamp, in year 34 of the Muslim era, they beat their own leader to death. Suddenly, the succession conundrum had turned into a horrifying crisis that threatened the very soul of Islam. For 4 days the mob rampaged through the city. The citizens of Medina cowered in their houses, waiting for the violence to die down. Even when the uproar faded, the leaders of the mob said they would not quit town until a new Khalifa was appointed, someone they could trust. Now, at last, all thoughts turned to the one candidate who had been passed over time after time, the man some had always called the Prophet's only legitimate successor, Muhammad's son-in-law Ali. At first, Ali refused the honor, but every other prominent member of the Muslim community turned down the caliphate as well, and the rebels threatened to launch a reign of terror unless Medina chose someone they could live with and chose him fast, so leading Muslims crowded into the mosque and begged Ali to take charge. What a strange moment this must have been for Ali. For 25 agonizing years he must have felt like he was watching the ship drift off course. 3 times, the Amir had rejected his leadership when he still would have had the power to make things right. Each time, he had been a good sport, because what else could he do? Trying to seize the helm would have split the community. He had to choose between causing trouble or watching the enterprise falter, killing it or letting it die. Only now, when things had gone so off-kilter that Muslims had murdered their Khalifa, now when his successor would face an impossible challenge, now the Amir was saying, "Take the reins, Ali." The 4th Khalifa. 36–40 AH, 656–661 CE. Ali finally accepted the caliphate, but in his first oration to the people, he told them he had accepted this office under duress. He lamented the unraveling of the Ummah in the single generation since the Prophet's death. It would take a stern hand to put things back in order, Ali said, and he gave the Ummah fair warning. From him, what they could expect was stern. One key segment of the community didn't hear him. The members of the Umayyad clan, Othman's close relatives, had fled to Damascus, where their kinsman Muawiyah had quietly been assembling his military force. Muawiyah began touring his province with a professional storyteller. At each stop, the storyteller aroused the crowd with a dramatic account of the murder in Medina. At the climactic moment, Muawiyah himself would burst on stage, waving a bloody shirt, the very shirt in which, he claimed, the Khalifa had been murdered. It was masterful political theatre. Muawiyah would then call upon the new Khalifa to arrest and punish Othman's murderers or step down. But how could Ali arrest the assassins? No one knew exactly who in that mob had dealt the actual blows. In any real sense, the whole mob was the assassin. To meet Muawiyah's demands, Ali would have had to arrest and punish the whole mob. This would never have been practical, but in the circumstances, it was utterly impossible. The mob still ruled the streets of Medina. Ali simply did not have the power to do as Muawiyah demanded, and the governor knew it. Besides, the rioters who murdered Othman had started out as victims of injustice and oppression. They had come to Medina with legitimate grievances, but in killing the Khalifa, they had handed the higher moral ground to their oppressors. Now, Ali was forced to choose between aligning himself with the oppressors or the murderers, a heartbreaking choice. He decided he would start by attacking the corruption rotting the empire. Win or lose, it was his only hope. By reversing Othman's policies and restoring rectitude, he might still pull the community back onto the path, thereby acquiring the credibility and stature he needed to do all the other things that needed doing. But a whole new class of nouveau riche had sprung out of the compost of the Muslim conquests, and this elite was not interested in Ali's idea of purity or his reforms. To them, Ali looked like a revolutionary threat, and Muawiyah looked like the guardian of their wealth and safety, the new status quo. Ali fired all the governors Othman had appointed and sent out new men to replace them, but none of the fired governors agreed to step down, except the one in Yemen, and he fled with all the money in the treasury, leaving a bankrupt province for Ali's appointee to take over. Meanwhile, trouble cropped up in another quarter. The Prophet's youngest wife Aisha happened to be in Mecca when Othman was assassinated. When Muawiyah began his ruckus, Aisha threw in with him, in part because there had always been bad blood between her and Ali. She announced her alignment with a fiery speech in Mecca. "Oh yeah people! Rebels, have murdered the innocent Othman. They violated the sanctity of the city of the Holy Prophet in the sacred month of Hajj. They plundered and looted the citizens of Medina. By God, a single finger of Othman was more precious than the lives of all the assassins. The mischief has not been crushed, and the murderers of Othman have not been brought to book. Seek satisfaction on these murderers. Only vengeance for the blood of Othman can vindicate the honor of Islam." Capitalizing on the passion she aroused, she assembled an army, convened a war council, and mapped out a campaign. The ousted governor of Yemen pledged all his stolen treasure to her cause. Flush with funds, Aisha led her troops north and stormed Basra, a key city in southern Iraq. She dispatched Ali's loyalists quickly and took over. At this point, someone started a whispering campaign charging Ali himself with complicity in the assassination of Othman. Poor honest Ali admitted that he bore some responsibility for the crime because when Othman was pleading for protection, Ali had withheld his sword arm. The thought that he might have saved Othman tormented the fourth Khalifa of Islam, and his honesty only fueled the rumors that undermined him. Ali tried to raise an army to fight Aisha, preaching that this was a jihad and that people should rally to defend Islam as they had in days of yore. But Muslims were confused, because Aisha was calling for jihad too, against Ali. Both sides claimed to be fighting for truth, justice, and the Islamic way, yet each was calling on Muslims to fight other Muslims. This wasn't what they called jihad back in the good old days. Curiously, Aisha's cohorts included two men, Talha and Zubayd, companions of the Prophet, who may have been part of the mob that attacked Othman's palace that day. If not themselves assassins, they were certainly associated with the assassins, yet here they were, leading members of a force vowing to avenge the assassination of Othman by toppling Ali. Ali marched out of Medina with the few troops he could muster, but various tribal warriors joined him on his way north, and his army grew to imposing size. When he reached Basra, he sent a trusted comrade into the city to negotiate with Aisha. Remarkably, the spokesman's arguments got through to the fierce young woman. First, she admitted that she didn't really think Ali had anything to do with Othman's murder. What she blamed him for was failing to arrest the criminals responsible. Then, she agreed that the criminals were part of a mob, and that the mob, which was still in charge, drew its strength from chaos. Next, she admitted that by fighting Ali, she was promoting chaos and so, yes, in a sense she herself was helping the assassins escape justice. By the end of the day, she had agreed to lay down her weapons, disband her army, and join forces with Ali. She would meet with him in the morning to discuss terms. The interaction reflected credit on both leaders, on Ali for seeking negotiation before battle, on Aisha for the intellectual honesty that enabled her, even in the heat of anger, even while surrounded by the smell of war and the threat of death, to listen to Ali's case and admit the validity of points that eroded her position just because they were true. In this, there was heroism. The envoy returned to Ali's camp to give him the good news, and that night celebration rang out on both sides. There would be peace. There was just one problem that no one took into account: both armies contained members of the very mob that had killed Othman and would be brought to book if Ali and Aisha made common cause. These men obviously could not afford to give peace a chance. Early the next morning, a gang of them crept out of Ali's camp and launched a surprise attack on Aisha's sleeping forces. By the time Ali woke up, Aisha's men were striking back. Both Ali and Aisha thought the other had double-crossed them, and thus began the Battle of the Camel, so called because Aisha rode a camel right into the battlefield and directed her troops from its back. The battle ended only when her camel was cut down and she was captured. Ali won the day, but what a bitter victory! It's difficult to imagine how the two of them must have felt, meeting after the carnage ended, the Prophet's adored wife and the Prophet's beloved son-in-law, face to face on a blood-soaked field littered with 10,000 Muslim dead, many of them close companions of the Messenger of God. As they pieced together how people and events had betrayed them both, these two survivors made some sort of peace with one another. Perhaps they found their way to a friendship, even. Perhaps, in some strange way, the tragedy that engulfed them both, and the horrors that neither could have wanted, drew them together. In any case, they never fought again. After the Battle of the Camel, Aisha retired to Medina, and spent the rest of her life recording the sayings of the Prophet and writing commentaries on them. She ended her days as one of the most respected early scholars of Islam. Ali never went back to Medina. He made the city of Kufa, in modern-day Iraq, his seat of government to reward the people of that city for supporting him, and he tried to piece together the remains of his caliphate, but the heartbreaking war with Aisha only marked the beginning of his troubles. The master troublemaker still loomed in the wings, sharpening his scimitar and drilling his troops. Muawiyah was getting ready for his final push. By this time, Muawiyah had formally refused allegiance to Ali and declared that the caliphate belonged to him. Both sides led armies into the field. In the year 36 AH, 657 CE, Ali confronted Muawiyah at the Battle of Siffin. It started when Muawiyah's army tried to block Ali's access to water. A brief battle burst out, but Ali's men gained the river bank, and the fighting subsided into a stalemate that lasted for months, interrupted only by sporadic skirmishes. Both sides were holding back, looking for a way to win without brutality, because each side stood to lose religious authority by spilling Muslim blood. The standoff ended with a 4-day outburst of violence in which some sources reckon that 65,000 people died. The slaughter led to calls that both armies pull back and let the two leaders settle the dispute with hand-to-hand combat. Ali, who was 58 years old but still a fearsome physical specimen, eagerly accepted the challenge. Muawiyah, who was about the same age as Ali, but dissipated and fat, said no. Ali's troops renewed the attack, this time felling Muawiyah's soldiers like weeds, but Muawiyah devised a stratagem to give them pause. He had his soldiers attach pages of the Quran to their lance tips and march behind recitation experts who chanted Quranic verses and exhorted Ali to negotiate in the name of peace among Muslims. Ali's troops quailed at the prospect of defiling the Quran and Ali agreed to negotiations. He probably didn't think of himself as giving in to anything, since he had been calling for negotiation from the start, but no doubt he was thinking of talks that would end with Muawiyah acknowledging his right to rule in exchange for some concession such as a guarantee to let him stay on as governor of Syria. Instead, when the representatives of the two leaders met, they agreed that the two men were equals, and that each should remain in charge of his own territories, Muawiyah ruling Syria and Egypt, Ali ruling everything else. This wasn't what Ali had been looking for, and it certainly infuriated his partisans, his Shia, to use the Arabic word a word that became the name of the sect that grew out of this rift. But Ali could not now reject the results without seeming to show bad faith. Muawiyah had snookered him. Besides, Ali was operating with a handicap. For 26 years Ali's Shia had been declaring that he possessed God-given powers of leadership, powers that could save the Muslim community from its ills. Originally, this claim referred to his blood relationship with the Prophet, but over the decades, as the first three caliphs were shaping a new social order, Ali had been delivering mystical sermons that held forth rapturously on the nature of Allah's omnipotence, immensity, oneness, and beyondness. In short, while the other caliphs had made themselves the guardians of Muhammad's communitarian vision, Ali had established himself as the keeper of the inner flame. So his partisans' proposition came to be that unlike all other claimants to the caliphate, Ali had some mystical personal access to Allah's guidance. His whole case rested on this image. Now he was negotiating. With Muawiyah, the utter embodiment of anti-Muslim materialism? What kind of God-gifted avatar of Allah-guided truth was he? Compromising with the enemy disappointed a faction of Ali's most committed followers, and these younger, more radical of his partisans split away. They carned to be known as Kharijites, ones who departed. This splinter group reformulated the ideals of Ali's followers into a revolutionary new doctrine. Blood and genealogy meant nothing, they said. Even a slave had the right to lead the community. The only qualification was character. No one was born to leadership, and mere election could not transform someone into the Khalifa. Whoever exhibited the greatest authentic devotion to Muslim values simply was the Khalifa, no election needed. He was, however, accountable to the people. If he ever fell a hair short of complete moral excellence, he forfeited his right to high office and someone else became Khalifa. Through what actual machinery all this demotion and promotion was to occur, the Kharijites didn't say. Not their problem. They only knew that Ali had squandered his entitlement and needed to step down, and since he didn't step down, one young Kharijite took matters into his own hands. In the year 40 AH, this hothead assassinated Ali. Ali's partisans immediately looked to his son Hassan as his successor, but Muawiyah swept this challenge aside by offering Hassan a sum of money to renounce all claim to the caliphate. Muhammad's older grandson, heartbroken and war-weary at this point, stepped aside. He had no stomach for continuing the fight, and under the circumstances now prevailing, claiming the caliphate could only constitute a power grab, and what good was that? And so the Umayyad dynasty began. Ali's death ended the first era of Islamic history. Muslim historians carn to call the first four post-Muhammad leaders the rightly guided caliphs. Life in their time was certainly not undiluted sweetness and wonder, but in calling them the rightly guided ones, I don't think responsible Muslim historians mean to suggest such perfection. Rather, they're saying that the evolution of the community from the time of the Hijra to the assassination of Ali was a religious drama. Yes, there was bloodshed and heartache, but the turmoil didn't stem from petty people vying for power, money, or ego gratification. The four caliphs and Muhammad's close companions who formed the core of the Ummah in this period were honestly striving to make the revelations work. Each of them had a handle on some essential aspect of the project, but no one of them was big enough to grasp the whole of it, as Muhammad had done. The Prophet's immediate successors were like the six blind men trying to discern whether the elephant was more like a rope, a wall, a pillar, or what. All the struggles over the caliphate in the period of the rightly guided ones had theological meaning because the issues they struggled with were essentially theological. After Ali's death, the caliphate was just an empire. Chapter 5, Empire of the Umayyads. 40 to 120 AH. 661 to 737 CE. Of course, Muawiyah did not present himself as the man who ended the religious era. He titled himself Khalifa and said he was continuing the same great mission as his predecessors. Toward the end of his life, however, he convened a council of Arab tribal leaders to discuss who his successor would be, a meeting that had the outward form of a shura, a consultative committee like the one Omar established. The chieftains thought their opinions were sincerely being solicited and began discussing the merits of this and that candidate. Suddenly one of the Khalifa's henchmen jumped to his feet and glowered around the circle. Right now, he scowled, this is the commander of the faithful. He pointed to Muawiyah. After he dies, it's this one. He pointed to Yazid, the emperor's eldest son. And if any of you object, it's this one. He pulled out his sword. They chiefs got the point. They went on through all the proper Muslim democratic forms and made all the appropriate noises and gestures, but in the end they dutifully chose Yazid to be their next Khalifa, and when they went home that night, they all knew the principle of succession would never come up for discussion again. When Yazid succeeded to the throne, however, he knew his father had not eliminated but merely suppressed rebellious elements. Yazid therefore kept close tabs on all who might challenge his power, especially Ali's relatives and descendants. Hassan had passed away by this time, but his brother Hussein was still alive, and just to be on the safe side, the emperor decided to have this man assassinated on his next pilgrimage to Mecca. Hussein was now in his 40s. He knew his father's partisans considered him to be the true Khalifa, he knew that zealous Muslims looked to him to keep the spiritual revolution alive, but no one man could shoulder such a heavy mantle. Hussein had opted out of politics and lived a quiet life of prayer and contemplation all these years, meditating on his grandfather's mission. But when he learned of the plot to have him killed, and that Yazid's assassins planned to murder him in the Kaaba itself, Hussein could take no more. He had no troops and no military experience. Yazid had a network of spies, a treasury, and an army. Even so, in the year 60 AH, 680 by the common calendar, Hussein announced that he was going to challenge Yazid and left Medina with a force of 72 people. Actually, calling it a force goes too far. The 72 included Hussein's wife, his children, and some doddering elderly relatives. Only a handful of the company were fighting-age males. What was the man thinking? Did he really imagine he could topple the Umayyad monarch with this tiny band? Was he perhaps thinking that if he just started marching, he would ignite a firestorm of revolt and inspire the tribes to join him? Probably not. In a final sermon before his departure, Hussein told his followers that he was sure to be slain but was not afraid, because death surrounds Adam's offspring as a necklace surrounds a young girl's neck. He noted a Quranic verse that told people to stand up to unjust rulers like Yazid. If the son of Ali and Fatima, the grandson of the Prophet himself, did not stand up to tyranny, who would? As portrayed in traditional accounts, therefore, Hussein was determined to make an example of his own life. Right from the start, he saw himself as embarking on a pilgrimage with ritual significance. In a sense, he was committing noble suicide. When Yazid heard that the Prophet's younger grandson was on the move, he sent an army to swat him down. Hussein posed no real threat to the empire, but Yazid wanted to crush him with overwhelming force as a warning to other radicals who might be tempted to play the God-chosen card. The army he sent outnumbered Hussein's little group by enough to make it no contest. Legends put that number at anywhere from 400 to 40,000. Whatever its size, this imperial army caught up with Hussein in the desert just south of Karbala, a city near the southern border of Iraq. If you glance at weather reports for that part of the world on any summer day, you'll see temperatures ranging upward of 115 degrees. On just such a sweltering day, the emperor's army trapped Hussein's little band within smelling distance of the Euphrates River but cut off from the water. Hussein, however, did what his father had failed to do. He refused to settle, compromise, or bargain. God had chosen him to lead the community of virtue, he said, and he would not disavow that truth. One by one, the warriors in Hussein's band sallied forth to fight Yazid's army. One by one they fell. The women, children, and old folks, meanwhile, all died of thirst. When the last of the party was gone, the victorious general swooped in, cut off Hussein's head, and shipped it to the emperor with a gloating note. The severed head arrived just as Yazid was entertaining a Byzantine envoy, and it spoiled the whole dinner party. The Byzantine envoy said, "Is this how you Muslims behave? We Christians would never treat a descendant of Jesus in this manner." The criticism angered Yazid, and he had the Roman thrown into prison. Later, however, he saw that keeping the severed head might be bad public relations, so he sent it back to Karbala to be buried with the body. Yazid no doubt believed he had solved his problem, surely Ali's descendants would never make trouble again. He was quite wrong, however. By crushing Hussein at Karbala, this emperor lit a spark. The passionate embrace of Ali's cause now became a prairie fire called Shi'ism. What is Shi'ism? One often hears it summed up as if it were just another quarrel about dynastic succession, like the battles between Maud and Stephen in 12th century England. If that had really been the case, the movement would have faded out after Ali died. Who today calls himself a Mahdist or a Stephanist? Who today even cares which of these two had the more legitimate claim to the English throne? Ali, however, kept gaining new adherents after his death. The ranks of his Shia kept on swelling. People who were not even born when Ali died grew up to embrace his cause and shape their identities around the conviction that he should have been the first Khalifa. How could this be? The answer, of course, is that the dispute about the caliphate was no mere dynastic struggle. Key religious issues were embedded in it, because the choice involved not just who but also what the leader would be. Ali's partisans saw in him something that they did not see in other claimants to the caliphate, a God-given spiritual quality that made him more than an ordinary mortal, a quality they had seen in Muhammad as well. No one said Ali was another messenger of God. No one would have made that claim, at that point, anyway, and so they gave Ali a different title. They said he was the Imam. Originally, Imam was simply the term for a person who led communal prayer. To most Muslims, that's still what the word means today. It's a title of respect, to be sure, but no more grandiose than, say, reverend or honorable. After all, every time a group of Muslims gathers to pray communally, one person among them has to lead the prayer, and he does nothing different than the others do, he just does it standing alone in front of the others to help keep the group moving in tandem through the ritual. Every mosque has an imam, and when he's not leading prayer, he might be sweeping the floor or patching the roof. But when Shia say imam, they mean something considerably more elevated. To Shia there is always one imam in the world, and there is never more than one. They proceed from the premise that Muhammad had some palpable mystical substance vested in him by Allah, some energy, some light, which they call the barakah of Muhammad. When the Prophet died, that light passed into Ali, at which moment Ali became the first imam. When Ali died, that same light passed into his son Hassan, who became the second imam. Later, the spark passed into Hassan's younger brother Hussein, who became the third imam. When Hussein was martyred at Karbala, the whole imam idea flowered into a rich theological concept that addressed a religious craving left unnourished by the mainstream doctrines of that time. The mainstream doctrine, as articulated by Abu Bakr and Omar, said that Muhammad was strictly a messenger delivering a set of instructions about how to live. The message was the great and only thing. Beyond delivering the Quran, Muhammad's religious significance was only his sunnah, the example he set by his way of life, an example others could follow if they wanted to live in God's favor. People who accepted this doctrine eventually came to be known as Sunnis, and they comprise 9/10 of the Muslim community today. The Shia, by contrast, felt that they couldn't make themselves worthy of heaven simply by their own efforts. To them, instructions were not enough. They wanted to believe that direct guidance from God was still coming into the world, through some chosen person who could bathe other believers in a soul-saving grace, some living figure who would keep the world warm and pure. They adopted the term Imam for this reassuring figure. His presence in the world ensured the continuing possibility of miracle. When Hussein went to Karbala, he had no chance of winning. His only hope lay in the possibility of God producing a miracle, but then, the continuing possibility of miracle was the principle he embodied. He and his band chose death as symbolic refusal to disavow this possibility, and, in the final analysis, to Shia, a miracle did occur at Karbala, the miracle of Hussein's martyrdom. To this day, Shia around the world commemorate the anniversary of Hussein's death with a day of cathartic mourning. They gather in lamentation houses to recount the story of the martyrdom, a religious narrative that casts Hussein in the role of a redemptive figure on an apocalyptic scale. By his martyrdom, Hussein has gained a place next to God and earned the privilege of interceding for sinners. Those who embrace him and believe in him will be saved and go to heaven, no matter what transgressions may foul their record. Hussein gave Shia this back door to the miracle they had hoped for all along. Believing in Hussein could not get you gold or high office or luck in love, but it could get you into heaven, that was the miracle. And now for the political story that unfolded after Muawiyah took power. The Umayyad ascension may have ended the birth of Islam as a religious event, but it launched the evolution of Islam as a civilization and a political empire. In the annals of conventional Western history, the Umayyads marked the beginning of Muslim greatness. They put Islam on the map by kicking off a golden age that lasted long after they themselves had fallen. Whatever his shortcomings as a saint, Muawiyah possessed tremendous political skill. The very qualities that helped him defeat the tormented Ali made him a successful monarch, and his reign institutionalized practices and procedures that would hold an Islamic empire together for centuries. This is all very ironic because, let us not forget, when Muhammad's prophetic career began, the Umayyads were a leading dan among the rich elite of Mecca. When Muhammad as messenger denounced the malefactors of great wealth who ignored the poor and exploited the widows and orphans, the Umayyads were some of the main people he was talking about. When Muhammad still lived in Mecca, the Umayyads outdid each other in harassing his followers. They helped plot the assassination of Muhammad before the Hijra and led some of the forces that tried to extinguish the Ummah in its cradle after the Muslims moved to Medina. But once Islam began to look like a juggernaut, the Umayyads converted, joined the Ummah, and climbed to the top of the new society, and here they were again, back among the new elite. Before Islam, they were merely among the elite of a city. Now, they were the top elite of a global empire. I'm sure many among them were scratching their heads, trying to remember what they ever found to dislike in this new faith. As rulers, the Umayyads possessed some powerful instruments of policy inherited from their predecessors, especially Omar and Uthman. Omar had done them a great favor by sanctifying offensive warfare as jihad so long as it was conducted against infidels in the cause of Islam. This definition of jihad enabled the new Muslim rulers to maintain a perpetual state of war on their frontiers, a policy with pronounced benefits. For one thing, perpetual war drained violence to the edges of the empire and helped keep the interior at peace, reinforcing the theory of a world divided between the realm of peace, Islam, and the realm of war, everything else, which developed in the days of the first caliphs. Perpetual war on the frontiers helped to reify this concept of war and peace. First of all, by making the narrative seem true, the frontier was generally a violent place, while the interior was generally a place of peace and security, and second, by helping to make it actually be true. By unifying the Arab tribes against a surrounding other, this concept of jihad reduced the incessant internecine warfare that marked Arab tribal life before Islam, and thus really did help to make the Islamic world a realm of relative peace. You can see this dynamic more clearly when you consider who fought the early wars of expansion. It wasn't so much a case of emperors dispatching armies of professional soldiers to do their bidding according to some master plan. The campaigns were fought by tribal armies who went off to battle more or less when they felt like it, as volunteers for the faith, responding more to the wishes than the orders of the Khalifa. If they hadn't been fighting at the borders to expand the territory under Muslim rule, they might well have been fighting at home to wrest booty from their neighbors. Perpetual war also worked to confirm Islam's claim to divine sanction, so long as it kept leading to victory. From the start, astonishing military and political success had functioned as Islam's core confirming miracle. Jesus may have healed the blind and raised the dead. Moses may have turned a staff into a snake and led an exodus for which the Red Sea parted. Visible miracles of this kind proved the divinity or divine sponsorship of those prophets. Muhammad, however, never really dealt in supernatural miracles such as those. He never solicited followers with displays of power that contradicted the laws of nature. His one supernatural feat, really, was ascending to heaven on a white horse from the city of Jerusalem, and this was not a miracle performed for the multitudes. It happened to him unseen by any public, and he reported it later to his companions. People could believe him or not, as they wished. It didn't impact his mission, because he wasn't offering his ascent to heaven as proof that his message was true. No, Muhammad's miracle, aside from the Quran itself and the persuasive impact it had on so many who heard it, was that Muslims won battles even when outnumbered 3-1. This miracle continued to unfold under the first caliphs as Muslim-ruled territory kept expanding at a breathtaking pace, and what could explain success like that except divine intervention? The miracle continued under the Umayyads. The victories didn't come as fast, nor as dramatically, but then, the opportunity for truly dramatic victories diminished over time simply because Muslims rarely found themselves as outnumbered as they were at first. The bottom line was that the victories kept coming and the territory kept expanding, it never shrank. So long as this was true, perpetual war continued to confirm the truth of Islam, which fed the fervor that enabled the victories, which confirmed the truth that fed the fervor, which enabled the victories that confirmed the truth, and so on, round and round. Perpetual war had some tangible benefits too. It brought in revenue. As Muslims told it, some law-defying potentate would tax his subjects until his coffers were overflowing, then the Muslims would appear, knock him off his throne, liberate his subjects from his greed, and take his treasures. This made the liberated people happy and the Muslims rich. Everybody ended up ahead except the defeated princes. 1/5 of the plunder was sent back to the capital, and at first all of it was distributed among the Ummah, with the neediest taken care of first. But with each Khalifa, an increasing percentage went into the public treasury. When the Umayyads took over, they started funneling virtually all revenue into the public treasury and using it to cover the costs of government, which included lavish building projects, ambitious public works, and extravagant charitable endowments. Revenue from the perpetual border wars thus enabled the Umayyad government to operate as a positive force in society, lavishing benefits on citizens without raising taxes. Then there were precedents bequeathed to the Umayyads by Khalifa Othman, who allowed Muslims to spend their money any way they wanted, so long as they followed Islamic strictures. Based on Othman's rulings, the Umayyads allowed Muslims to purchase land in conquered territory with money borrowed from the treasury. Of course, one had to be very well connected to get such loans, even more so than in Othman's time, and since Islam outlawed usury, these loans were interest-free, which is nice financing if you can get it. Omar had ordered that Muslim Arab warriors moving into new territories stay in garrisons apart from local populations, in part to avoid trampling on the rights and sensibilities of the locals, in part to keep Muslims from being seduced by pagan pleasures, and in part to keep the minority Muslims from being absorbed into the majority locals. In Umayyad times, these garrisons evolved into fortified Arab cities housing a new landed aristocracy, who owned and profited from vast estates in the surrounding countryside. Islamic society bore no resemblance to feudal Europe, however, where manors were largely self-sufficient economic units, producing for immediate consumption. The Umayyad Empire hummed with handicrafts, and it was sewn together by intricate trade networks. Wealth milked out of the vast estates didn't just sit there but proliferated into trade goods that flowed to distant lands and brought other trade goods flowing back. Garrison cities softened into busy commercial entrepôts. The Islamic world was dotted with vigorous cities. It was an urbane world. Muawiyah himself, reviled by the devout as a poor show next to such spiritual giants as the rightly guided caliphs, proved himself no slouch as an economic manager and politician. Ruthless but charming, he gained the cooperation of fractious Arab chieftains, mostly with persuasion, using his military and police powers largely to put down revolts and impose law and order, which benefited him but also smoothed the way for civilized life. Consider the mixture of stick and carrot in this warning to the people of Basra, issued by Muawiyah's adopted brother Ziyad, whom he had appointed governor of Basra: you allow kinship to prevail and put religion second, you excuse and hide your transgressors and tear down the orders which Islam has sanctified for your protection. Take care not to creep about in the night. I will kill every man found on the streets after dark. Take care not to appeal to your kin, I will cut off the tongue of every man who raises that call. I rule with the omnipotence of God and maintain you with God's wealth. I demand obedience from you and you can demand uprightness from me. I will not fail in 3 things, I will at all times be there for every man to speak to me. I will always pay your pensions punctually and I will not send you into the field for too long a time or too far away. Do not be carried away by your hatred and anger against me, it would go ill with you. I see many heads rolling. Let each man see that his own head stays upon his shoulders. Worldly tough guys though they were, the Umayyads nurtured the religious institutions of Islam. They supported scholars and religious thinkers, built mosques, and enforced laws that allowed the Islamic way of life to flourish. Under the Umayyads, it wasn't just Arab-inspired commercial energy that permeated the Muslim world but also Islam-inspired social ideals. Nouveau riche lords made abundant donations to philanthropic religious foundations called waqf. Social pressure drove them to it, but so did religious incentives. Everyone wants the esteem of his or her society, and a rich man could garner such esteem by patronizing a waqf. In theory, a waqf could not be shut down by its founder. Once born, it owned itself and had a sovereign status. Think of it as a Muslim version of a non-profit corporation set up for charitable purposes. Under Muslim law, the waqfs could not be taxed. They collected money from donors and distributed it to the poor, built and ran mosques, operated schools, hospitals, and orphanages, and generally provided the burgeoning upper classes with a means for expressing their religious and charitable urges and to feel good about themselves even while lolling in wealth. Of course, someone had to administer a waqf. Someone had to conduct its business, set its policies, and manage its finances, and it couldn't be just anyone. To possess religious credibility, a waqf had to be staffed by people known for piety and religious learning. The more famously religious its staff, the more prestigious the waqf and the more respect accrued to its founders and donors. Since the waqfs ended up controlling real estate, buildings, and endowment funds, their management offered an avenue of social mobility in Muslim society, even though many waqfs became a device by which rich families protected their wealth from taxation. If you acquired a reputation for religious scholarship, you might hope to gain a position with a waqf, which gave you status if not riches, and you didn't have to hail from a famous family to become a famous religious scholar. You just had to have brains and a willingness to practice piety and study hard. On the other hand, you did have to know Arabic, because it was the sacred language. To Muslims, the Quran itself, in Arabic, written or spoken, is the presence of God in the world. Translations of the Quran are not the Quran. Besides, all the pertinent scholarly books were written in Arabic. And you did, of course, have to be Muslim. What's more, the Umayyads soon declared Arabic the official language of government, replacing Persian in the east and Greek in the west and various local languages everywhere else. So Umayyad times saw an Arabization and Islamification of the Muslim realm. When I say Islamification, I mean that growing numbers of people in territories ruled by the Khalifa abandoned their previous faiths, Zoroastrian, Christian, pagan, or whatever, and converted to Islam. Some no doubt converted to evade the poll tax on non-Muslims, but this probably wasn't the whole story, because after conversion people were liable for the charity tax incumbent on Muslims but not on non-Muslims. Some may have converted in pursuit of career opportunities, but this, too, can be overstated, because conversion really only opened up the religion-related careers. The unconverted could still own land, operate workshops, sell goods, and pursue business opportunities. They could work for the government too, if they had skills to offer. The Muslim elite did not hesitate to take from each according to his abilities. If you knew medicine, you could be a doctor. If you knew building, you could be an architect. In the Islamic Empire, you could become rich and famous even if you were a Christian or a Jew, the Abrahamic religions, or eventually Zoroastrian, even though this was more distant from Islam. But most people, I think, in the world Muslims came to rule, converted to Islam because it looked like the truth. Certainly, no other force or movement in the Middle World at this time had the muscular self-confidence and the aura of inexorable success of Islam. Who would not want to join the Ummah if they could? And they could. It was easy. All a person had to do was say La ilaha illallah wa Muhammadur Rasulullah, there is no God but God and Muhammad is his messenger. That's all it took to gain membership in this triumphant dub. But the core creed was much more loaded than it may have looked at first blush. No God but God, that phrase alone has engendered countless thousands of volumes of commentary, and no one has yet come to the end of what it means. And on top of that, Muhammad is his messenger. Sign on to that one, and you've accepted everything Muhammad prescribed as messenger. You've committed yourself to 5 daily prayers, to avoidance of pork, to the Ramadan fast, to sobriety, and to much, much more. Chapter 6, The Abbasid Age. 120 to 350 AH. 737 to 961 CE. The descendants of Yazid ruled for a number of generations. They wove a skein of entrenched power over the Muslim world, extended their suzerainty to Spain in the west and India in the east. Under their administration, the doctrines of Islam were elaborated, written down, and sealed into codebooks. A body of religious scholars came to own those codebooks, the way lawyers in America own the Constitution and the laws spun from it, and those religious scholars worked in tandem with the politicians and bureaucrats of the Umayyad court to forge a distinctly Islamic society. Mainstream Western histories usually praise this process. The Umayyads introduced that wonderful quality called stability to the civilized world. Stability enabled farmers to plan next year's crop. It enabled businessmen to invest in long-term projects. It encouraged students to enter upon long courses of study with confidence that what they learned would still apply by the time they had graduated. Stability gave scholars the freedom to lose themselves in study and dig deep into the mysteries of nature without having to worry that their families were meanwhile getting killed by thugs. All this came at a price, however, the usual price of stability, which ensures that whatever is the case one day is even more the case the next day. The rich got richer. The poor increased in numbers. Cities with magnificent architecture sprang up, but so did vast slums sunk in squalid poverty. Justice became a commodity that only the rich could afford. Other problems bubbled up too. The rapid expansion of Islamic rule brought many different ethnicities under the Muslim umbrella, and there was some question about how to make the Muslim promise of brotherhood and equality work for all of them. Umayyad policies may have promoted Arabization and Islamification, but not both of them equally everywhere. In North Africa, Arabization proceeded rapidly, perhaps because the patchwork of indigenous cultures had long ago been fragmented by Phoenician colonization. The Romans had deposited a Latin layer, the Vandals had come in with a Germanic glaze, and finally Christianity had permeated the region. North Africa had no single language or culture to bind it together. When the Arabs arrived with their powerful conviction, no correspondingly unified and powerful indigenous conviction was there to resist them. So the Arabs thoroughly dissolved and absorbed whatever was there before. Egypt and the Levant were somewhat easily digested too, because many of these peoples shared a historical narrative with the Arabs, harking back to common traditional ancestors such as Abraham, Noah, and Adam himself. Most of the inhabitants had already subscribed to the idea of monotheism. Hebrew and Aramaic were Semitic languages, like Arabic. Persia, however, that was quite a different matter. The Persians were an Indo-European people, not Semitic. They had an ancient civilization of their own, a proud history, and a language that would not be subdued. Many Persians accepted Islam, but they would not be Arabaized. Those who did convert to Islam presented the society with a challenging religious contradiction. Islam claimed to make every Muslim equal to every other. Join the Ummah and you join an egalitarian brotherhood, such was the promise of this new religion, this powerful movement. But the Arab-dominated society forged by the Umayyads couldn't deliver on the promise. Arabs were the rulers now, they were the aristocrats. Far from making even a show of equal status for all, Umayyad society spawned formal institutions to discriminate among various gradations of folk in society and to keep them layered: pure-blooded Arab Muslims at the top, below them, Muslims with one Arab and one non-Arab parent, then non-Arab Muslims, then non-Arab Muslims with non-Muslim parents, then non-Muslims who at least belonged to one of the monotheistic faiths, and so on down to the lowest of the low-rank polytheists born of polytheistic parents, who had virtually no legal rights. Friction among all these designated social gradients, and especially the friction between the Arab nouveau aristocrats and the Persian former aristocrats, kept a sense of grievance smoldering beneath the surface in this portion of the Muslim realm. Another shadow haunted the conscience of the Islamic world as well. Muslim sacred history was problematically rich with anecdotes about the simple, rugged lifestyle of the founders. Their simplicity and humbleness went to the very essence of their appeal as religious figures. Inevitably, therefore, a feeling started percolating in the lower reaches of this new society that something about all this splendor wasn't right. This prosperous, pleasure-plump society could not be what Allah had meant when He charged Muhammad with establishing a just community devoted to worship of the one God. Of course, the richer you were, the less likely that such considerations would trouble your dreams. For the poor, however, tales of luxury at court and the sight of perfumed Arab noblemen riding through the streets clad in silk had to evoke comparisons with Muhammad's simple blanket folded 4 times to provide both mattress and cover, and Khalifa Omar at his cobbler's bench, mending his own shoes. Add to all this the odor left by the way in which the Umayyads came to power, a process that had generated 2 enduring opposition movements, the Shia and the Kharijites. The Kharijites were the less numerous, but their movement was more radical. Their theology had come to focus on extravagant demands for purity. They said the leadership of the Muslim world belonged to the person who most assiduously practiced what the religion preached. No secular ruler could ever meet the standards of the Kharijites. In fact, quite probably, no ruler anywhere could ever meet their standards, period, so the Kharijites could preach revolution no matter what the circumstances. As long as anyone was in power, someone would feel oppressed, and as long as anyone felt oppressed, Kharijite agitators could use their doctrines to fuel insurgencies. As time went on, however, Kharijites fizzled out because they were such extreme purists at a time when more and more people were acquiring a stake in the new prosperity. Society's losers might have been discontented, but they were even less ready to trade in the little they had for the joyless nothing the Kharijites offered. It was the Shia who remained the real threat to the established order, and after the death of Hussein and his followers at Karbala, this threat picked up force. The Shiite imams no longer directly challenged the throne very much, they began to separate the meaning of imam from the meaning of khalifa, defining themselves ever more purely in religious terms. But Shiite rebels kept organizing trouble in the name of the imams, kept sparking rebellions aimed at bringing one or another of Ali's descendants to power, kept nurturing the notion that the caliphate did not belong to the Umayyads, kept undermining the legitimacy of Islam's secular rulers. The Shiite threat metastasized because of an ominous synchronicity that developed in Umayyad times. It was this: the Shia were the suppressed religious underdogs of Islam. The Persians were the suppressed ethnic underdogs of Islam. The Shia chafed against the orthodox religious establishment. The Persians chafed against the Arab political establishment. Inevitably, the one mapped onto the other. Persians began to embrace Shiism, and Shiite agitators began looking to the Persian East for recruits. When the two currents mingled, rebellion began to bubble. It bubbled ever harder the further east one traveled, for Umayyad police power ran ever thinner in that direction, while anti-Arab sentiment mounted ever higher. One day, around 120 AH, a mysterious man blew into the city of Merv. This distant outpost of the empire lay almost 1,500 miles east of Damascus. Here in the wild east, this stranger began to agitate against the Umayyads by promulgating a millennia religious narrative that spoke of an impending apocalyptic showdown between good and evil. No one knew much about this fellow, not even his real name. He went by the handle Abu Muslim, but that was obviously a pseudonym, since it was short for Muslim Abu Muslim bin Muslim, which means Muslim man, son of a Muslim father, father of a Muslim son. As you can see, this man was at pains to assert that he had no doubt about it Muslim credentials. In truth, Abu Muslim was a professional revolutionary, dispatched to Merv by a secretive underground group based in Iraq, a group called the Hashemites. This group was a cross between a cult and a political party, whose core membership probably never exceeded 30. Its name referred to the Prophet's clan, the Banu Hashim, and its purpose, supposedly, was to put a member of the Prophet's family at the head of the Muslim world. This was just one of many angry little hardcore bands of anti-government conspirators active at this time, all preaching some version of the same message. The community had fallen off the track, history had gone off course, the messenger's mission had been subverted, and toppling the Umayyads and empowering a member of the Prophet's family in their stead would set everything right again. Let me note that this narrative has been reinvented again and again in the Muslim world over the course of history, and some version of it is being recited even today, by revolutionaries who have substituted the West for the Umayyads. Sadly for the Hashemites, they didn't have an actual member of the Prophet's family to promote. They did, however, have Abu al-Abbas, a fellow who claimed descent from Abbas ibn Abd al-Muttalib, one of Prophet Muhammad's uncles, so he was at least related to the Prophet by blood and, more important, was willing to lend his name to the Hashemite enterprise. The ancestral uncle in question, the original Abbas, was among the later converts to Islam, and in his day, inconveniently enough, no one had even considered him a candidate to succeed Muhammad, so he wasn't the ideal ancestor for a revolutionary purist. A direct descendant of Ali and Fatima would certainly have been better, but none of the elites, that is, Ali's real and putative descendants, would make common cause with the Hashemites, so Abu al-Abbas would have to do. Sometimes you have to go into battle with the figurehead you have, not the figurehead you wish you had. Abu Muslim didn't have much trouble tapping into the Shiite and Persian discontent seething in Khorasan, the province that stretched from Iran through Afghanistan. At key points in his speeches, Abu Muslim became a little vague about who exactly would become the Khalifa once the revolution succeeded. Those who longed for a descendant of Ali could imagine that such a figure was waiting in the wings, anonymous for the moment only for security reasons. Daring, ruthless, and charismatic, Abu Muslim quickly outgrew his role as anybody's agent and emerged as the leader of the Abbasid Revolution, so named for its putative leader, Abu al-Abbas. There in Khorasan, Abu Muslim recruited a revolutionary cadre, trained them to fight, and steeped them in Hashemite doctrines. His recruits could be recognized by the black clothes they wore and the black banners they carried. They even dyed their weapons black. The Umayyad army, incidentally, adopted white as its color. Lest you think this color coding strange for a cult that preached an apocalyptic showdown between good and evil, you should know that in Persia white was regarded as the color of mourning, the color of death. The recent revolutionary Afghan Muslims called the Taliban favored black clothing as a uniform. In the year 125 AH, 747 CE, Abu Muslim and his black-suited warriors began moving west. They encountered little resistance passing through Persian territory, where most people were eager to help topple the arrogant Umayyads. In fact, they gained recruits and momentum as they marched along. In 750 CE, the armies of white and black clashed on the banks of the Great Zab River in Iraq. Although outnumbered, the men in black routed the emperor's forces, and the last Umayyad Khalifa had to run for his life, south into Egypt. Within the year, Abbasid agents hunted him down there and killed him. The Hashemites proclaimed Abbas the new Khalifa of Islam. Nobody really commented on the process that had just taken place. It wasn't an inevitable God-shaped outcome, nor an election, nor even a decision made by a council of wise men. No, the new Khalifa was placed in power by one man with a tightly organized gang of enforcers. It didn't matter. Leadership was, phew, back where it belonged at last, in the hands of a member of the Prophet's family. Now, finally, the Muslim social project could get back on course. That was probably the happiest year of Abu Muslim's life, the year his life's work came to fruition at last. Perhaps he really thought that toppling the Umayyads would restore the quest for the lost community. Disillusionment soon set in, however. For one thing, the puppet did not, it turned out, consider himself a puppet. Over the years, Abbas had built a real base within the movement that had chosen him as its figurehead, and now that Abu Muslim had done the donkey work, he said thank you very much and took the throne. The new Khalifa remembered that Muawiyah had consolidated his power by slipping a velvet glove over his iron fist and winning over former foes with courtesy and charm. Accordingly, the new ruler invited leading members of the Umayyad clan to break bread with him, just to show that there were no hard feelings. Well, I shouldn't say break bread. That makes it sound like he was going to serve his guests a simple meal of barley bread and soup, such as the Prophet might have shared with Omar. That sort of thing was now out of fashion. No, the Umayyad survivors found themselves lolling on cushions while servants pranced in with lovely trays piled high with gourmet delicacies. The laughter rang out, the conversation turned spirited, and a sense of camaraderie swelled. Just as everyone was getting ready to tie into the meal, however, the waiters threw off their robes to reveal armor underneath. They weren't waiters, it turned out, but executioners. The Umayyads jumped to their feet, but too late, the doors had all been locked. The soldiers proceeded to club the Umayyads to death. From that time on, Abbas went by a new title, Al-Safa, which means the slaughterer. Apparently, he took some pride in what he had done. Little good it did him, however, for he soon died of smallpox and his brother Al-Mansur took over. Mansur had to tussle with rivals a bit, but Abu Muslim stepped in and secured the throne for him, then returned to Khorasan. Abu Muslim made no bid for the caliphate on his own behalf, even though he had the military power to take what he wanted. He seemed to accept the legitimacy of Abbasid rule. Perhaps he really was a principled idealist. And yet there was something Mansur just didn't like about this man, Abu Muslim. Well, perhaps it was one particular thing: Abu Muslim was popular. All right, two things: he was popular, and he had soldiers of his own. A ruler can never trust a popular man with soldiers of his own. One day, Mansur invited Abu Muslim to come visit him and share a hearty meal. What happened next illustrates the maxim that when an Abbasid ruler invites you to dinner, you should arrange to be busy that night. The men got together at a pleasant riverside campsite and Mansur spent the first day lavishly thanking Abu Muslim for all his selfless services. The next night he had his bodyguards cut Abu Muslim's throat and dump his body in the river. Thus began the second dynasty of the Muslim Caliphate. Abbasid propagandists got busy creating a narrative about the meaning of this transition. They called it a revolutionary new direction for the Ummah. Everything would be different now, they said. In fact, everything remained pretty much the same, only more so, both for better and for worse. The Umayyads had steeped themselves in pomp and luxury, but the Abbasids made them seem by comparison like rugged yeomen living the simple life. Under the Umayyads, the Muslim realm had grown quite prosperous. Well, under the Abbasids, the economy virtually exploded with vigor. And like the Umayyads, the Abbasids were secular rulers who used spies, police power, and professional armies to maintain their grip. Since the Abbasids had risen to power on a surge of Shiite discontent, you might suppose that in this regard at least they would have differed from the Umayyads, but in this supposition you would be dead wrong. The Abbasids quickly embraced the orthodox approach to Islam, probably because the orthodox religious establishment, all those scholars, had secured so much social power in Islam that embracing their doctrines was the politic thing to do. Indeed, it was only in Abbasid times, as we shall see in the next chapter, that the mainstream approach to Islam acquired the label Sunnism, since only now did it congeal into a distinct sect with a name of its own. In the first days of the Abbasid takeover, many naive Shia thought that Safa and his family were going to put the recognized Shiite Imam on the throne, thereby inaugurating the millennial peace predicted in Hashemite propaganda. Instead, the hunt for alids intensified. In fact, when the third Khalifa of this dynasty died, according to one of his maids, his successor found a secret room in his palace, which led to an underground vault where he had collected the corpses of all the alids he had captured and killed. They weren't necessarily Fatima's descendants, since Ali had other wives after Fatima died. Yet the Abbasids also maximized everything that was good about Umayyad rule. The Umayyads had presided over a flowering of prosperity, art, thought, culture, and civilization. All this splendor and dynamism accelerated to a crescendo during the Abbasid dynasty, making the first 2 centuries or so of their rule the one that Western history, and many contemporary Muslims, remember as the Golden Age of Islam. One of Mansur's first moves, for example, was to build himself a brand new capital, a city called Baghdad, completed in 143 AH, 765 CE. The city he built has survived into the present day, though it has been destroyed and rebuilt several times over the centuries, and is in the process of being destroyed again. Mansur toured his territories for several years before he found the perfect site for his city, a place between the Tigris and Euphrates where the rivers came so close together that a city could be stretched from the banks of one to the banks of the other. Smack dab in the middle of this space, Mansur planted a perfectly circular ring of wall, 1 mile in circumference, 98 feet high, and 145 feet thick at the base. The city within this huge donut was really just a single enormous palace complex, the new nerve center for the world's biggest empire. It took 5 years to build the round city. Some 100,000 designers, craftspeople, and laborers worked on it. These workers lived all around the city they were building, so their homes formed another, less orderly ring of city around the splendid core. And of course shopkeepers and service workers flocked in to make a living selling goods and services to the people working on the round city, which added yet another urban penumbra around the disorderly ring that surrounded that perfect circular core. Within 20 years, Baghdad was the biggest city in the world and possibly the biggest city that had ever been. It was the first city whose population topped 1 million. Baghdad spread beyond the rivers, so that the Tigris and Euphrates actually flowed through Baghdad, rather than beside it. The waters were diverted through a network of canals that let boats serve as the city's buses, making it a bit like Venice, except that bridges and lanes let people navigate the city on foot or on horseback too. Baghdad might well have been the world's busiest city as well as its biggest. 2 great rivers opening onto the Indian Ocean gave it tremendous port facilities, plus it was easily accessible to land traffic from every side, so ships and caravans flowed in and out every day, bringing goods and traders from every part of the known world: China, India, Africa, Spain. Commerce was regulated by the state. Every nationality had its own neighborhood, and so did every kind of business. On one street you might find doth merchants, on another soap dealers, on another the flower market, on yet another the fruit shops. The street of stationers featured over 100 shops selling paper, a new invention recently acquired from China, whom the Abbasids met and defeated in 751 CE, in the area that is now Kazakhstan. Goldsmiths, tinsmiths and blacksmiths, armorers and stables, money changers, straw merchants, bridge builders and cobblers, all could be found hawking their wares in their designated quarters of mighty Baghdad. There was even a neighborhood for open-air stalls and shops selling miscellaneous goods. Yaqubi, an Arab geographer of the time, claimed that this city had 6,000 streets and alleys, 30,000 mosques, and 10,000 bathhouses. This was the city of turrets and tiles glamorized in the Arabian Nights, a collection of folk stories transformed into literature during the later days of the Abbasid dynasty. Stories such as the one about Aladdin and his magic lamp hark back to the reign of the fourth and most famous Abbasid Khalifa, Harun al-Rashid, portrayed as the apogee of splendor and justice. Legends about Harun al-Rashid characterize him as a benevolent monarch so interested in the welfare of his people that he often went among them disguised as an ordinary man, so that he might learn firsthand of their troubles and take measures to help them. In reality, I'm guessing, it was the Khalifa's spies who went among the people disguised as ordinary beggars, not so much looking for troubles to right as malcontents to neutralize. Even more than in Umayyad times, the Khalifa became a near-mythic figure, whom even the wealthiest and most important people had little chance of ever seeing, much less petitioning. The Abbasid Khalifas ruled through intermediaries, and they insulated themselves from everyday reality with elaborate court rituals borrowed from Byzantine and Sassanid traditions. So, yes, Islam conquered all the territories ruled by the Sassanids and much that had once been ruled by the Byzantines, but in the end the ghosts of those supplanted empires infiltrated and altered Islam.
That is all for now. If you want to know what happened next to the Muslim dynasty, stick around for the part 3 of this video. Please like and subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification so you never miss an update. Thank you for watching.